You're telling me my life has a price tag? Lisa's voice trembled, the heavy parchment in her hands violently shaking. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. It's a debt, Lisa. To David, the Alpha King. I am a human being, not currency, she screamed, the heavy oak doors of their estate mocking her desperation. He doesn't want currency. He needs an heir, and you've been sold to bear it. The finality in his words dropped the temperature in the room to freezing. She was sold to the Alpha King to bear his heir. But as she stared at the black wax seal on the contract, Lisa vowed one thing. David might own her future, but he would never, ever have her heart. The tires of the armored SUV hissed against the wet asphalt. Lisa sat in the back, her fingers digging so deeply into the leather seats, her knuckles turned white. Rain lashed against the tinted windows, blurring the neon lights of the city's skyline. She wasn't just leaving her home, she was leaving her autonomy. A man in a sharp charcoal suit sat across from her. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left her father's house. He didn't need to. The contract resting in his steel-clasped briefcase did all the talking. $20 million. That was the price of her father's gambling syndicate debts. Paid in full by David, a man whose name was whispered in boardroom corners and underground dens with equal parts reverence and terror. The vehicle pulled into a subterranean garage that looked more like a military bunker than a parking structure. The suited man motioned for her to step out. The air smelled of ozone and expensive exhaust. "This way," the man said, his voice completely devoid of empathy. They took a private elevator that shot upward, the G-force making Lisa's stomach plummet. The brushed steel doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a penthouse that spanned the entire top floor. It was a study in brutalist luxury. Dark slate floors, floor-to-ceiling glass offering a dizzying panoramic view of the storm-drenched city, and minimalist furniture that looked entirely too expensive to sit on. "Wait here." The handler vanished through a set of double doors, leaving Lisa alone in the cavernous living space. She wrapped her arms around herself. The temperature was perfectly climate-controlled, yet she felt freezing. She walked toward the glass, staring down at the microscopic headlights moving on the arteries of the city below. She was a bird in a gilded, bulletproof cage. "They say the city looks peaceful from up here." A voice rumbled from the shadows behind her. "It's a lie." Lisa spun around, her pulse spiking. David stood in the doorway. He didn't look like a king, at least not the fairy tale kind. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a map of faded scars and dark, intricate ink. His face looked as though it were carved from granite, with a brutally strong jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky, ice blue and completely unreadable. The sheer physical presence of him commanded the room, sucking the oxygen from the air. This was the Alpha. Lisa forced her chin up, refusing to let him see the tremor in her knees. "I didn't expect you to be so domestic." David stepped fully into the room, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him. His gaze swept over her, not with predatory lust, but with the cold calculation of an auditor assessing an asset. "And I didn't expect a woman sold for $20 million to have a sharp tongue," he replied, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated against her ribcage. He walked to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured a measure of amber liquid. "Drink?" "I want to know the rules," Lisa said, ignoring the offer. David paused, the heavy crystal glass halfway to his lips. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. He set the glass down with a soft clink. "The rules are simple, Lisa." He slowly closed the distance between them. Lisa held her ground, though every instinct in her body screamed to step back. You live here. You are provided for. You want for nothing. Except my freedom. Freedom is a luxury your father traded away. He was standing mere inches from her now. She could smell sandalwood and something metallic, like impending rain. You are here to give me an heir. Once the child is born, the debt is settled. You can walk away. And the child? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. David's jaw tightened. A microscopic flickers of something, pain, regret, crossed his eyes before the ice returned. The child stays. It is my legacy. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The cold, transactional nature of his words felt like a physical blow. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a partner. She was an incubator. I am not a machine, she finally said, her voice steadying as righteous anger replaced her fear. I will not just lie down and be a vessel for a man who bought me. David tilted his head, studying her with a new, piercing intensity. I don't expect you to lie down, but I do expect you to understand your position. You are in my territory now. Then God help your territory. Lisa shot back, her eyes flashing with a defiant fire she didn't know she still possessed. For a fraction of a second, the corner of David's mouth twitched, a micro-expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned his back on her, walking toward the dimly lit hallway. Your room is the second door on the left. Dinner is at 8. Do not be late. As he disappeared into the shadows, Lisa let out a ragged breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt a little less suffocating, but she knew the war had only just begun. The bedroom was a masterpiece of suffocating luxury. Silk sheets, a king-sized mahogany bed, and a walk-in closet filled with designer clothes, meticulously tailored to her exact measurements. Lisa stared at the rows of dresses, a sickening realization washing over her. They had been preparing for this for weeks. Her father had sold her out long before the final signature on the contract. She bypassed the opulent gowns and chose the simplest garment she could find. A dark navy slip dress that felt more like armor than evening wear. At precisely 7:55 p.m., she navigated the labyrinthine hallways toward the dining room, guided by the soft clinking of silver against fine china. The dining table was absurdly long, made of a single slab of polished black walnut. David sat at the head, illuminated by the low light of a modern chandelier. He was already eating, a wireless earpiece tucked into his right ear, his eyes locked on a glowing tablet. Lisa took a seat halfway down the table, leaving a deliberate, defensive expanse of wood between them. A silent attendant immediately appeared from the periphery, placing a plate of seared scallops in front of her. The shipments from the northern docks are delayed, David said, his voice flat, clearly speaking to whoever was on the other end of the encrypted line. I don't care about the union strikes. If the steel isn't moved by midnight, Marcus will see it as a sign of weakness. Lisa picked up her fork, chewing methodically. The food tasted like ash. Offer them a 5% cut on the back end, David ordered, a muscle feathering dangerously in his jaw. No, tell them that's the final offer. If they refuse, shut down the entire port. Let them starve for a week. He pulled the earpiece out, tossing it onto the table with a clatter. He finally looked at Lisa, as if just registering her physical presence in the room. You look pale, he observed, his tone clinical. And you look like a tyrant, Lisa replied evenly, cutting a scallop in half. David set his cutlery down. He didn't look angry, he looked intrigued. I am protecting my investments. The northern pack, Marcus's territory, is testing the borders. In my world, weakness invites slaughter. Shutting down the port doesn't show strength, it shows panic, Lisa said before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was absolute. The attendant standing in the corner seemed to shrink into the shadows, terrified of the impending fallout. David leaned forward, slowly lacing his fingers together over the table. "Excuse me?" Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs, but she refused to back down. Her father had run a gambling syndicate. She had grown up listening to ruthless men negotiate power through closed doors. A 5% cut on the back end is a bribe. It tells the union you're desperate to move the steel to appease Marcus. If you shut down the port entirely, you bleed your own revenue just to make a point. And what would the $20 million collateral suggest? David's voice was dangerously low, a soft growl that hinted at the apex predator beneath the bespoke suit. "You give the union the weekend off." "Paid," Lisa said, meeting his icy stare without blinking. "You tell Marcus the delay is due to mandatory structural inspections you ordered. You reframe the delay not as a strike you can't control, but as an operational pause you initiated. It shifts the power dynamic. The union is happy, Marcus thinks you're meticulous, and you don't look desperate." David stared at her. The seconds ticked by, heavy and loaded. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall seemed to amplify in the quiet room. Slowly, David picked up his earpiece. He tapped it, reconnecting the line. "Cancel the previous order," he commanded, his eyes never leaving Lisa's. "Give the dock workers the weekend off." Paid. "Send a message to Marcus's people. Inform them of mandatory crane inspections. We resume operations on Monday." He pulled the earpiece out again. The silence returned to the dining room, but the texture of it had fundamentally changed. It was no longer entirely hostile. It was charged. "Where did you learn to play chess with supply chains?" he asked, his tone softer. "I didn't just sit in a tower waiting to be sold," Lisa said, taking a sip of water to hide the shaking of her hands. "I ran the books for my father, until he gambled it all away." David nodded slowly, a microscopic shift in his rigid posture. He picked up his fork. "The dress suits you." It was a deflection, a sudden pivot that left Lisa momentarily off balance. She looked down at her simple navy dress, then back up at him. "Don't patronize me," she said. It wasn't a patronization. It was an observation. He took a bite of his food. "I expected a weeping girl. I did not expect a strategist." "I'm neither," Lisa said sharply. "I am a prisoner?" "For now," David murmured, almost entirely to himself. The rest of the dinner passed in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. The invisible glass wall between them hadn't crumbled, but a single hairline fracture had just appeared. The morning sun offered no warmth through the heavily tinted glass of the penthouse. Lisa sat perched on the edge of the examining table in one of the spare guest rooms that had been converted into a sterile medical suite overnight. Dr. Heir, an older man with a sharp, bird-like face and impossibly cold hands, was reading from a digital clipboard. "Vitals are standard. Blood panels show no genetic markers of concern," the doctor recited, not making eye contact with her. He spoke of her as if she were a prize mare at an auction. "We will begin the hormone optimization protocol today. It will ensure maximum fertility during the alpha's cycle." Lisa flinched, her muscles locking. Hormone optimization? No one said anything about drugs. "It is standard procedure, Miss Lisa," Dr. Heir said, finally looking up with a patronizing sigh. He turned his back to prepare a syringe, the clear liquid catching the harsh fluorescent light. "The Alpha King's time is incredibly valuable. We cannot leave conception to the slow whims of natural biology. I won't take it. Lisa crossed her arms, her heart hammering wildly against her sternum. The loss of her freedom was one thing. The chemical invasion of her body was another entirely. This is not a negotiation, Dr. Aris said, stepping closer, tapping the needle to release an air bubble. Hold out your arm. I said no. Lisa backed away, sliding off the table until her back hit the edge of the counter. The heavy door clicked open. David stepped into the room, dressed in a dark tailored suit, a phone pressed to his ear. He paused immediately, taking in the scene. The rigid line of Lisa's shoulders, the syringe gleaming in the doctor's hand, the palpable scent of fear in the air. He lowered the phone. What is going on here? Just a minor resistance to the optimization protocol, Alpha? Dr. Aris said smoothly, though a bead of sweat formed on his graying temple. I was just explaining to the girl. Her name is Lisa. David interrupted, his voice dropping a terrifying octave. The sheer command in his tone made the doctor visibly flinch. David walked slowly toward them. His gaze flicked from Lisa's pale, terrified face to the needle in the doctor's hand. Explain the protocol, David demanded softly. It accelerates ovulation, Alpha. It is designed to ensure immediate viability. Lisa watched David closely. His jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. Did I order this protocol, Aris? No, Alpha, but it is customary for cattle, David snarled. He moved so fast, Lisa barely registered the motion. He snatched the syringe from the doctor's hand and tossed it forcefully into the biohazard bin, where it shattered on impact. She is not livestock. You will not drug her. Alpha, with respect, the Council expects an heir swiftly. Marcus's pack is watching your bloodline. Let Marcus watch. David's voice was a lethal whisper. He crowded the doctor, his sheer size and furious energy intimidating the older man backward. If I ever catch you trying to inject her with something I haven't explicitly approved, I will feed you to the hounds. Pack your equipment and get out. Dr. Aris scrambled to pack his leather bag, his hands shaking violently. Within seconds, the door shut behind him, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Lisa stood by the counter, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist. She was shaking, the massive adrenaline crash hitting her hard. David stood with his back to her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling heavily. He finally turned. The lethal, violent edge in his eyes softened, just a fraction, as he looked at her. Are you all right? He asked. The question was surprisingly gentle. You expect me to believe you didn't know? Lisa accused, though her voice wavered dangerously. I didn't. David ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare sign of physical frustration. Aris is an old fool loyal to the Council's outdated traditions. I will have him replaced immediately. Replaced with someone who will just force me politely? She snapped, hot tears of frustration stinging her eyes. She fiercely refused to let them fall. David stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. I told you last night, Lisa. You are in my territory. That means I protect you, even from my own people. Why? She asked, searching his unreadable blue eyes. I'm just a debt, a transaction. Because, David said slowly, his gaze dropping momentarily to her trembling lips before snapping back to her eyes. You are mine to protect, and I don't let anyone damage what belongs to me. The fierce possessiveness in his words sent a shiver down her spine. And to her horror, it wasn't entirely out of fear. It was a terrifying realization. She was a pawn in a dangerous game, surrounded by wolves. And the most dangerous predator of all was the one standing right in front of her. But as he looked at her, she saw a flicker of something raw and deeply buried beneath the ice. "Get dressed," David said softly, stepping back to give her space. "We have a meeting with the council tonight, and you are coming with me." "Me? Why?" "Because," he said, pausing in the doorway, "it's time they realize my future queen is not a silent vessel." Lisa stared at the empty doorway long after he had gone, the heavy weight of the word queen echoing loudly in her head. The subterranean estate of the Alpha Council felt less like a seat of government and more like a crypt, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the city. The air in the long, vaulted corridor was thick with the scent of aged mahogany, cigar smoke, and an undercurrent of predatory musk that made the hairs on the back of Lisa's neck stand at attention. She walked beside David, the heels of her simple black pumps clicking sharply against the polished obsidian floor. He had insisted she wear something comfortable, yet commanding. She had chosen a structured charcoal blazer and tailored trousers, armor for the modern age. "Stay close," David murmured, his voice barely carrying over the ambient hum of the estate's ventilation. He didn't look at her, his jaw set in a rigid line, but his hand moved to hover just an inch from the small of her back. The phantom heat of his proximity sent a confusing thrill through her system. "I'm not exactly going to make a run for it," Lisa whispered back, keeping her eyes fixed on the towering brass double doors at the end of the hall. "It's not you running that I'm worried about. It's them lunging." Before she could process the gravity of his warning, two enormous guards hauled the heavy doors open. The council room was a theater of intimidation. A circular table of polished granite dominated the space, surrounded by a dozen men and women whose eyes snapped to the entrance the second David crossed the threshold. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, heavy with unasked questions and barely concealed disdain. "Alpha." An older man with silver hair and a face deeply etched with cruelty stood up. His pale eyes drifted from David to Lisa, his lip curling in unmistakable disgust. "I see you brought your collateral. We were under the impression this was a closed session regarding the northern border." "Sit down, Silas," David said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command whipped through the room like a physical strike. Silas's jaw tightened, but he slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair. David pulled out a chair for Lisa. It wasn't in the periphery, it was directly at his right hand. The collective intake of breath from the council members was audible. "Lisa is not collateral," David announced, taking his own seat at the head of the table. His ice-blue gaze swept over the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "She is the mother of the future heir. And as of tonight, she is privy to the operational logistics of this pack." "This is madness, David," a woman with sharp cheekbones and a severe bun hissed, leaning forward. "She is human. She is the daughter of a degenerate gambler. You expect her to sit in on discussions of war with Marcus's pack?" "I expect her," David replied, his voice dangerously soft, "to sit wherever I tell her to sit." The tension in the room was a living, breathing thing. Lisa kept her hands folded tightly in her lap under the table, digging her nails into her palms to stop them from shaking. She was completely out of her depth, surrounded by apex predators who viewed her as less than nothing. Silas scoffed, tossing a thick leather folio onto the granite table. "Fine. Let the girl listen to our demise. Marcus has amassed 300 enforcers at the river boundary. They are strangling our supply chains. The port shutdown cost us millions, and now they are targeting our offshore accounts. We are bleeding capital, David." The port shutdown was a strategic necessity. David countered smoothly. It was a band-aid. Silas snapped. We need to strike back. We mobilize the enforcers and hit Marcus's strongholds in the Lower East Side. If we don't show force, the other packs will smell weakness. If you hit the Lower East Side, you fall into a financial trap, Lisa said. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. The room froze. 12 pairs of lethal, glowing eyes slowly turned to fixate on her. The sheer weight of their collective animosity was suffocating. But Lisa forced her chin up, refusing to break eye contact with Silas. "Excuse me?" Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, inhuman resonance. David didn't intervene. He leaned back slightly in his chair, watching Lisa with a sudden, intense curiosity. "The Lower East Side strongholds," Lisa continued, her voice steadying as the numbers, her comfort zone, crystallized in her mind. "I reviewed the ledgers my father kept on Marcus's betting parlors. Those strongholds aren't revenue generators. They are heavily leveraged liabilities. Marcus has been bleeding money there for years. He's deliberately heavily staffing them." "Your point, girl?" the severe woman demanded. "My point," Lisa said, sitting up straighter, "is that he wants you to attack them. If you mobilize your enforcers to destroy his worst assets, he can claim the insurance, cut his losses, and while your forces are distracted downtown, his main army will sweep through your undefended northern territories. It's a classic short squeeze tactic, just applied to territory instead of stocks." A deafening silence descended upon the granite table. The council members looked at one another, the arrogant bluster slowly draining from their faces as the brutal logic of her words sank in. Silas looked at the map projected on the center of the table, his silver eyebrows pulling together. "If she is right, she is right," David said softly. He turned his head to look at Lisa, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just approval. It was raw, unfiltered respect. "Deploy the enforcers to the northern ridge," David commanded, shifting his attention back to the council, the lethal alpha fully emerging. "Leave the Lower East Side untouched. Let Marcus choke on his own bad investments. We hold the high ground." As the council scrambled to adjust the tactical maps, David leaned in slightly, his shoulder brushing against hers. "I thought I bought a vessel," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear, sending a shiver straight down her spine. "Turns out, I bought a general." The adrenaline crash hit Lisa the moment the private elevator doors slid shut, sealing them back inside the penthouse. Her knees suddenly felt like they were made of water, and she reached out, steadying herself against the cool, brushed steel wall. "Breathe." David's voice came from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, a violent thunderstorm was raging, violently lashing rain against the thick glass and illuminating the brutalist living room in sharp, jagged flashes of lightning. Lisa closed her eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. "I shouldn't have spoken. I overstepped." "You saved me from walking into a slaughter," David corrected her. He was standing by a low crystal table, pouring 2 glasses of water. He walked over and held one out to her. She took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was incredibly warm, a stark contrast to the freezing chill that had settled in her bones. "They hate me," Lisa said quietly, staring down into the clear liquid. But Silas looked at me like I was an insect. Silas looks at everyone like they are insects. It is a defense mechanism for small men masquerading as giants, David said, moving to stand beside her, looking out at the glittering, rain-slicked city. He had shed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, looking devastatingly rugged in the dim light. "He's right, though, isn't he?" she whispered. The fight temporarily drained out of her. "I don't belong in that room. I don't belong in this world. I'm just here to settle a debt." David turned to look at her, his ice-blue eyes darkening with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. A clap of thunder rattled the glass, but neither of them flinched. "Do you know why I paid $20 million for you, Lisa?" he asked softly. "Because I'm young, healthy, and my father owed you," she recited bitterly, echoing Dr. Aris's clinical assessment. "No." David stepped closer. The scent of sandalwood and ozone wrapped around her, intoxicating and dangerous. "I could have bought 10 surrogates for a fraction of that cost. Women who would have happily taken the money and asked no questions." Lisa frowned, looking up at him, her heart skipping a beat at his proximity. "Then why?" David looked away, his gaze fixing on a jagged scar that peeked out from beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "My father was a traditional alpha, ruthless, unforgiving. He believed in bloodlines and power above all else. When I was born, I wasn't strong enough. I was sickly. A disappointment." Lisa remained perfectly still, afraid to shatter the fragile vulnerability in the room. This was a man who commanded legions, admitting weakness. "He tried to have me discarded," David continued, his voice completely devoid of emotion, which somehow made the words more horrific. "My mother intervened. She was human, a vessel just like you. She didn't have claws or fangs, but she had a mind like a steel trap. She leveraged the pack's finances, blackmailed the council, and secured my place. She died for it a few years later." He finally looked back at Lisa, his eyes burning with a fierce, quiet intensity. "I don't need an incubator, Lisa. I need a mother for my child who will fight for them the way mine fought for me. When I investigated your father's debts, I saw you. I saw a woman holding together a crumbling empire through sheer willpower and intellect. I didn't buy a womb. I bought the strongest woman I could find." The revelation hit Lisa like a physical blow. The narrative she had constructed, the cruel, transactional alpha king who saw her as mere currency, was crumbling, revealing a man deeply scarred by his past, desperately trying to rewrite the future. "You still bought me," she whispered, her voice trembling, though this time not from fear. "You still took my choice." David reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed lightly over her cheekbone. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of. "I know," he murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before returning to hers. "And it is the only sin in my life that I actually regret." He didn't lean in to kiss her. He didn't push. He simply let the weight of his confession hang in the charged air between them, leaving the choice, for the first time since they met, entirely in her hands. 3 days later, the fragile, unspoken truce between them was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Lisa was in the penthouse library, a sprawling room filled with first editions and leather-bound ledgers. She had taken it upon herself to start reviewing the pack's legitimate business holdings, a distraction from the confusing, magnetic pull she felt whenever David was near. The heavy thud from the hallway above was subtle, barely audible over the soft jazz playing on the sound system. But Lisa's survival instincts, honed by years of living with a volatile father, flared instantly. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. Another thud, heavier this time, followed by a sharp, static hiss that meant the internal security comms had been jammed. The power in the penthouse instantly cut out, plunging the library into near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, ambient glow of the city lights bleeding through the windows. "David?" Lisa whispered into the darkness, her pulse hammering in her ears. A shadow detached itself from the doorway. It wasn't David. The figure was massive, reeking of wet copper and adrenaline. Well, a gravelly voice sneered in the dark. "Marcus sends his regards. Said to bring back the Alpha's new pet in pieces." Lisa didn't scream. Screaming wasted breath. She grabbed a heavy brass bookend from the nearest shelf and hurled it at the shadow's face. The man grunted as the brass clipped his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He lunged, moving with a terrifying, supernatural speed. Before he could reach her, the library doors exploded off their hinges. David hit the intruder like a freight train. The impact sounded like two boulders colliding. They crashed into a massive mahogany bookshelf, sending hundreds of books cascading to the floor in a cloud of dust. "Get down!" David roared, his voice distorted, deeper and more guttural than Lisa had ever heard it. She scrambled backward, diving behind a heavy leather armchair. The fight in the dark was brutal and terrifyingly fast. It wasn't a boxing match. It was a lethal struggle between apex predators. Lisa heard the sickening crunch of bone, the tearing of fabric, and heavy, wet thuds. A second intruder vaulted through the broken doorway, holding a serrated hunting knife that gleamed in the ambient light. He bypassed David, his eyes locking onto Lisa's position behind the chair. "David!" Lisa screamed as the second man charged her. She rolled to the side, just as the blade buried itself deep into the leather upholstery where her head had been a second before. She kicked out blindly, her heel connecting solidly with the man's knee. He snarled, stumbling, but recovered instantly, raising the knife again. A heavy, silver letter opener caught Lisa's eye, resting on the edge of the fallen desk. She lunged for it, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal, and thrust it upward just as the man dropped his weight onto her. The silver blade sank into the man's shoulder. He shrieked, a high, unnatural sound, and recoiled, the silver burning his skin on contact. Suddenly, David was there. He grabbed the screaming intruder by the throat with one hand, lifting him entirely off the floor. With a brutal, economic motion, David hurled the man through the massive plate glass window. The glass shattered in a deafening explosion, raining down onto the balcony as the intruder vanished into the storm outside, falling 40 stories to the street below. The room fell deadly silent, save for the howling wind whipping through the broken window and the ragged, heavy breathing of the Alpha King. David stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving. His white shirt was torn to shreds, and blood, dark and thick, was running down the side of his face from a deep gash near his temple. His eyes, glowing with a faint, unearthly blue light in the darkness, locked onto Lisa. She was sitting on the floor, clutching her knees, her hands trembling violently. In a flash, David crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of her. The terrifying, monstrous energy radiating from him vanished, instantly replaced by a frantic, desperate panic. "Are you hurt?" His hands hovered over her, terrified to touch her, scanning for injuries. "Lisa, look at me. Are you bleeding?" "I'm fine," she choked out, reaching up. Her shaking fingers found the side of his face, touching the blood sliding down his jaw. "You're hurt. It doesn't matter," he breathed, closing his eyes at the contact, leaning into the warmth of her palm. The glow in his eyes faded back to normal ice blue as he opened them. "When I saw him coming for you." God, Lisa, my heart stopped. In the ruins of the library, surrounded by shattered glass and the bodies of his enemies. David didn't look like a king, and he certainly didn't look like a captor. He looked like a man who had just realized he had something to lose. Before Lisa could overthink it, before the logic of their contract could stop her, she leaned forward and crashed her lips against his. The shattered glass of the library window had been cleared away by dawn, replaced by reinforced polymer that held back the gray morning drizzle of the city below. But the destruction inside the room, and inside Lisa's heart, remained entirely untouched. She stood by the new glass, wrapped in one of David's oversized cashmere sweaters, watching the city wake up through a veil of mist. Her lips still tingled from the kiss they had shared in the aftermath of violence. It hadn't been a calculated political move or a contractual obligation. It had been pure, unfiltered instinct, an admission that amidst the blood and cold marble, they were both desperately human. A soft click behind her signaled his approach. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the heavy, grounding weight of his presence filling the space. "The cleanup crew finished 2 hours ago," David said. His voice was low, carrying a slight, gravelly fatigue. He stepped up beside her, his gaze sweeping over her profile. "None of Marcus's men survived the extraction. The council knows what happened. Silas tried to call an emergency meeting at dawn, but I canceled it. You can't avoid them forever," Lisa murmured, finally looking up to meet his eyes. The gash on his temple had already begun to scab over, a testament to his accelerated healing. "I'm not avoiding them. I'm prioritizing," David replied, his ice-blue eyes softening as they rested on her. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch made her breath hitch. "After last night, the rules of this arrangement changed, Lisa. Whether you want to admit it or not. You bought me, David," she whispered, the reminder tasting like ash, though the conviction behind it was fading. "That doesn't just disappear because we fought off 2 men in a library." "I bought a debt," David corrected, his voice dropping into a fierce, quiet intensity. "I never bought you. You proved that last night when you picked up that silver letter opener and fought for your life. And for mine. A vessel doesn't bleed for its owner. A partner does." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. He was right. The moment she threw herself into the fray, the dynamic of power had shifted. She was no longer just a prisoner of war. She was an active participant in his survival. Before she could form a reply, the secure terminal on the mahogany desk chimed. A sharp, triple pulse, indicating an incoming priority transmission from the financial district. David's jaw tightened. He cast one last lingering look at Lisa before turning toward the desk. He punched a code into the glass panel, and a holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the room, displaying a sprawling, complex web of offshore corporate accounts, dummy entities, and betting syndicates. "What is that?" Lisa asked, stepping closer, her analytical mind instantly kicking in as she stared at the data streams. "Marcus's true lifeline," David said, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the numbers. The assassination attempt wasn't just a random hit. It was a distraction. While we were fighting in this room, Marcus's financial advisors were liquidating every single asset tied to your father's old syndicate. They are trying to drain our liquidity reserves before the market opens. Lisa stared at the scrolling numbers, her brow furrowing. She walked around the desk, leaning over the holographic projection, her eyes darting across the transaction codes and routing numbers. Years of auditing her father's illegal operations had trained her to see patterns where others saw chaos. "They aren't just liquidating," Lisa said suddenly, her voice sharp with sudden realization. She pointed a finger at a glowing cluster of red nodes. Look at the routing sequence. It's routed through a shell company in the Lower East Side, the very strongholds we talked about 3 days ago. David turned his head sharply, looking at her with intense focus. Explain. Marcus isn't trying to hide his money. He's trying to create a systemic crash. Lisa explained rapidly, her fingers instinctively tracing the air as if manipulating physical ledgers. If these accounts collapse simultaneously, it will trigger an automatic margin call across all major PAC-backed institutions. The council will panic. They'll force you to liquidate your primary holdings to cover the deficit, leaving the northern ridge completely undefended. A heavy silence filled the room. David stared at her, not with surprise, but with a profound, terrifying awe. You see the whole board, don't you? He whispered. I see a trap, Lisa corrected, looking up at him. And if we don't counter-execute within the next 20 minutes, Marcus is going to checkmate us before breakfast. The war room of the Alpha Council was typically a place of shouting matches, posturing, and thinly veiled threats. Today, it was a tomb of absolute silence. The 12 council members sat around the polished granite table, their faces pale, staring at the flashing red alerts pulsing across the central display. The financial collapse Lisa had predicted was happening in real time. Millions of dollars were evaporating into the digital ether as Marcus's coordinated asset dump overwhelmed the PAC's primary banking nodes. And we are bleeding out, Silas stammered, his silver hair disheveled, his usual arrogance completely shattered. He slammed his palms onto the table. David, we have to liquidate the Northern Ridge assets immediately to cover the margin call. If we don't inject capital into the central bank right now, the entire PAC will go bankrupt. If we liquidate the Northern Ridge, David said calmly, standing at the head of the table with his hands resting flat on the granite surface. Marcus's army will march through the valley within 6 hours. We trade financial ruin for literal slaughter. Then what do you propose? The severe woman hissed, her eyes darting frantically around the room. We have no liquidity left. Unless you have a miracle hidden in your pocket, we are done. The heavy double doors of the war room clicked open. Every head snapped toward the entrance. Lisa walked in. She wasn't wearing her simple black pumps or armor-like blazers today. She wore a sharp, midnight blue silk blouse and tailored trousers, her posture immaculate, her head held high. She didn't look like collateral. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a general stepping onto a conquered field. Silas scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a bitter sneer. What is the human doing here? This is a council session, not a nursery. Shut up, Silas, David commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl that commanded instant obedience. He didn't take his eyes off Lisa as she walked to the end of the table, standing directly beside him. You want liquidity? Lisa asked, her voice steady, cutting cleanly through the tension of the room. She tapped a sleek, digital tablet she carried, transmitting a new data set directly to the central display. The flashing red alerts suddenly shifted, replaced by a complex, glowing structural blueprint and a massive ledger of unexploited assets. The council members leaned forward, squinting at the screen. What are we looking at? The severe woman demanded, her voice laced with confusion. You are looking at Marcus's actual blind spot, Lisa said, her eyes sweeping over the hostile faces in the room without an ounce of fear. While Marcus has been dumping his public and semi-legal syndicates to crash our central bank, he has been quietly funneled capital into an unregistered, private cryptocurrency and rare earth mineral reserve buried deep beneath the Lower East Side docks. He thinks it's hidden. It isn't. She tapped the screen again, highlighting a series of encrypted wallet addresses. My father kept a secondary ledger, Lisa continued, a faint, confident smile touching the corner of her lips. Not the books he showed Marcus, but the real ones. Marcus didn't just borrow money from my father. He stored his contingency wealth in my father's offshore protocols. I have the cryptographic keys. Silas stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. You can access his emergency reserves? Better than that, Lisa said smoothly. If David authorizes a targeted legal freeze through the International Banking Commissioner, utilizing the exact debt transfer contract that brought me to this penthouse, we can legally impound Marcus's private mineral reserve as collateral for my father's unpaid debts. She looked sideways at David. He was watching her with an expression of such pure, burning adoration that for a split second, the rest of the room melted away. You seize his hidden reserves, Lisa concluded, turning back to the stunned council. You instantly gain $200 million in unencumbered liquidity. You neutralize his financial attack, and you leave Marcus completely broke before he even realizes his vault has been picked clean. A deafening silence descended upon the war room. The council members looked from the glowing screen to Lisa, then to David. The arrogance, the disdain, the prejudice that had greeted her on her first night in this subterranean crypt had vanished, replaced by an undeniable, begrudging respect. Silas swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the edge of the table. By the goddess. David stood up slowly. He didn't look at the council. He looked only at Lisa. Execute the transfer, David commanded, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable power. The sun broke through the heavy, gray clouds of the city, casting a warm, golden hue across the brutalist penthouse. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, crisp morning air that smelled of wet pavement and possibility. The war had ended not with the thunder of enforcers clashing on the northern ridge, but with the silent, surgical strike of a brilliant mind. Marcus's syndicate had collapsed within 3 hours of the asset freeze. Stripped of his wealth, abandoned by his allies, and cornered by the Alpha Council's legal maneuverings, the rival Alpha had fled across the northern border, permanently neutralized. In the penthouse library, the shattered glass had been replaced, the books restored to their shelves. Lisa stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the golden light dance across the skyscrapers. The gilded cage no longer felt like a prison. It felt like home. Footsteps echoed softly on the slate floor. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, pulling her back against a warm, solid chest. The familiar scent of sandalwood and ozone filled her senses. The financial commissioners just finalized the transfer, David murmured into her ear, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. Marcus's remaining assets have been absorbed into the pack reserves. We are secure. Lisa leaned back into his embrace, letting out a long, contented breath. She set her coffee cup down on the small table and turned within his arms, wrapping her hands around his neck. "And the debt?" she asked, a playful smile dancing in her eyes. "Is my father's balance sheet finally clear?" David smiled. A rare, full, breathtaking smile that transformed his harsh, granite features into something tender and devastatingly handsome. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored vest and pulled out a thick, heavy piece of parchment marked with a black wax seal. The original contract. Without a word, David raised his hand and ripped the parchment cleanly down the middle, tearing it into halves, then quarters, before dropping the pieces into the nearby wastepaper basket. The debt was paid in full the moment you walked into that war room. David said softly, his ice-blue eyes burning with a deep, infinite warmth. You are not collateral, Lisa. You never were. Lisa's heart swelled. She reached up, her fingers tracing the edge of his jawline, feeling the strong, steady pulse beneath his skin. You bought a prisoner, David. But you ended up with something entirely different. I bought a queen, he corrected, his voice dropping into a husky, resonant purr. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing her cheekbones. I started this journey believing power was about control, about breeding bloodlines, about winning wars through brute force. You taught me that true power is partnership. True strength is love. Do you still want an heir? She whispered, a teasing smile playing on her lips. David's eyes darkened with a sudden, intense hunger, though his expression remained profoundly tender. He leaned in, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers. I want everything with you, Lisa, he murmured against her mouth. An heir, a lifetime, a kingdom. Only if you choose it. No contracts, no chains. Lisa didn't answer with words. She pulled him down, crashing her lips against his in a deep, passionate kiss that sealed their past, their present, and their unbreakable future. In a world ruled by fangs, claws, and cold iron, they had found something infinitely stronger. A love forged in fire, built on mutual respect, and destined to rule an empire. In the end, Lisa and David proved that true strength isn't about dominance, control, or the weight of ancient debts, but about standing side by side as equals when the world tries to tear you apart. Through courage, intellect, and an unexpected consuming love, they shattered the chains of tradition and built a legacy rooted in genuine partnership. If you enjoyed this journey through the shadows and light of the Alpha King's world, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling, heart-pounding romantic dramas.